Okay,
Oh, in fact, were you sitting here?
slides are still here.
She's sleeping. Okay, no, I. These are softer seats. I like them better than the hard traditional. Well.
So have we gotten?
I do a share screen.
Share screen. It'll all be fine.
It's.
Okay.
He didn't make it, you know, it's nice.
Okay, there we go. I think we're good. And all you have to do is just click on forward.
Okay.
And since we are recording, if you could like stand in front, the camera's right there. So instead of wandering, if you could spend as much time as possible in front.
Or we can turn it a little bit.
Yeah,
How would that be?
yeah.
That's fine.
Well, either one or the other, either one or the other. Yeah,
And it will work for the,
I
okay,
think all you have to do is click.
Okay. should be fine. As long as I don't do anything else.
Good.
That's right.
Hopefully the technology will work this week. We'll see. It is tough. You have to toggle between the slide and Zoom.
Did you hit record?
Yeah, we already did that. So we're recording this preamble, so to speak.
Trying.
The most interesting. Converse. Who knows?
Oh, Dave. I didn't meet with the kneecap. So he did like bring them to life. So they come down to the
It's just interesting because. Well, everybody's dying conversation.
Come back and tell how it's going.
I feel like
But it's not, well, it's not the kind of pain that I feel when I'm just. Yeah, it's inevitable that they sever some nerves. It's like you said, they often go back. We'll see. But he also told me that,
are you retired or you're?
that knee replacements. I guess supposed to release 78%. It's rare.
Well, I think. Hearing notes on, we made your license. It's an office, you show up. Well, I retired just 3 years ago. Coming up on I mean, I still have an office. But I admire anything stays on. No, it's still fun. No, the art department. Doing their job, they get paid for their people, they live on their state salary and they keep measuring students, they keep going out on. You know that. Oh, I know, I can. Knowledge room.
I've had somebody have dinner with.
That's what I was very slow.
So, yes. I think it's very common. I didn't really. But I. Including sharing. I also. I mean, like, what's the worst thing you do?
Yeah.
When I see you retired. That's not inspired, but I'm going. And I have to say something. So anyway, by then maybe things will have calmed down and. But I think my husband has. Paper teacher.
I know they don't need to interact with. I mean, that was their site, the majority of our. They're all. So they have all their.
Yeah.
Buried under.
The library for a while in.
The stand.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
upstairs
not-
is standard.
yeah.
So that's where I remember for.
Yeah.
We had a couple of international events.
So, Quite enough. But I don't want to-
No, that's, but that's. No.
I mean, yeah, so now you don't. That. And so, yeah, so you this way. Why would you?
Oh, I That's great. Probably this. No, you still cancel this week. Sorry.
Oh,
Jim?
well, there's. Which I don't ordinarily get to. Now, if you had like them, my friends, and still, and some, and then there's other, he's now, that's for. In a way that used to be 5,000. Couple of that. Great.
I think it's ready to go.
Every day.
Okay, everyone, I think we probably should get started. And it's about 25 of. I want to welcome everyone, which I think is our fourth presentation of the spring semester. Fortunately, they're on Mondays, because not Tuesdays, because tomorrow looks like a big storm. In fact, there've been several, we just about, there've been several storms on Tuesdays, but we've dodged the bullet by having our presentations on Monday. And with me today is our speaker, Mary Beth Winn. In fact, I also wanted to say that she was recently awarded the Emeritus Center's Fellows Award for her, I think it's, we call it exemplary and sustained accomplishments post-retirement. Yeah. So there'll be some emails out on that. That was just about a week ago. I think the board voted to approve her application. So I'll turn the formal introductions over to Dean, our program chair.
And it would be painfully clear that I'm not a French speaker as I pronounce some of this, so my apologies in advance.
I hope you're using a better phonetics dictionary.
That was in my Webster's, yes, Joe. Later, Joe. Yes, I'm being picked on because, 2 weeks ago, I actually looked up a word that Professor Kevin Knuth was using, and I looked it up for the pronunciation because I never heard the word before. And this guy is sitting over there saying, he's not in STEM, because obviously the pronunciation for my 1964 Webster's was wrong. So you can pick on me again, Chris.
Entropy, not entropy.
My Webster's, that's what it told me.
No, what Webster?
Well, apparently.
Or it's coming. That's right.
So I'm pleased to offer a brief introduction to our speaker today, who I've known for years and enjoyed working with. Mary Beth Winn is Professor Emerita of French Studies at the University of Albany, having joined its faculty after earning her PhD at Yale University. Her research focuses on 15th and 16th century French literature and the history of the book, especially the work of Parisian publisher bookseller Antoine Virard. Oh, that was all right? Okay.
Did your press report?
Yes, we did that earlier. Thank you. I appreciate that, because that's the other thing I'm known for, is not hitting record. So. Text editor for the chansons of Renaissance composers, Thomas Croquillon. Thank you. And G. Moton. Okay. She has just published a critical edition of the prose Tristan and is completing an edition and study of the Le Revent.
Ravissant.
Okay. By Robert Gobin. Both works printed by Virard. Her research considers issues of patronage, the transition between manuscript and print, and correlations of literature and the arts. And Ed stole my thunder, is going to announce that she has been selected a Setter Fellow. So Mary Beth, thank you.
Thank you. I really should start by thanking you first for inviting me to speak today, and second for braving the elements, because today is rather gloomy for coming out. And I'm afraid my subject, although it deals with dance, it also deals with something a little more sober. We'll get to that in a minute. As you know, I've borrowed my title from Kevin Costner's film of 1990, but his wolves are very different from my wolves. They come from a work entitled Les Loups Ravissants, or The Ravishing Wolves, that was written in 1505 by a priest and ecclesiastical lawyer by the name of Robert Gobin. And I suppose it should be Robert Gobin, but I have a very hard time using the English version, so you'll have to bear with my French. It was published shortly thereafter by Antoine Virard, who had the work illustrated by 2 series of woodcuts. 10 copies of the edition are known, 9 of which are printed on paper and illustrated with black and white woodcuts. 1 copy, now in the National Library in Paris, was printed on vellum, and all the woodcuts were painted. And the colored examples that I'm going to show are coming from that copy. The author declares his book to be a moral treatise against sin and vice, but it takes the form of a dream vision. Here's the dreamer, which the author experienced on New Year's Eve in 1505, and which he then records. Here's the colored version. In the dream, Archie Lupus, or Archwolf, leads a rowdy band of wolves against a saintly shepherdess who is called Sainte Doctrine, Holy Doctrine, and her flock of sheep. And here are the main figures. So we have the author, the Archie Lupus, and Holy Doctrine. And there's a colored version there. In characterizing the wolves as ravissants, Gobin is playing with a double entendre. For ravishing can be captivating, dazzling, or enticing, but also raping, ravenous, and greedy. Wolves have a long association with evil, and they are, of course, the natural enemy of sheep. But Gobin also referenced the Christian tradition of Christ as the Lamb of God, as well as the Good Shepherd from the New Testament, where Christ says he will lay down his life for the sheep, while a hired hand will flee before the wolf. That's from the book of John, if you're interested, the Gospel of John. Gobin leaves no doubt as to what the wolves represent. He says, ambitious and envious sinners given to sensuality. The little wolves, and I love their name, they're lupili, represent sinners who do the opposite of God's commands. Archwolf calls them fils de putain, this is for my French colleagues, which means children of prostitutes, vaguely, while he himself represents Satan, the devil from hell. Gobin says that wolves are everywhere. They have overrun the church and the state. They are usurers and pimps, avaricious and treacherous, those who deceive and corrupt, not only among merchants and tavern keepers, financial officers and lawyers, but especially among the clergy. Gobin is a priest, remember? Gobin's satire operates primarily through the changing roles of archwolf in human society, roles that are specifically named in the text, mocked in descriptions of clothing and gesture, and depicted in the woodcuts. Archwolf is, of course, anthropomorphized, walking, speaking, and dressing like a human. He begins as a docteur, seated on this professorial chair, to teach disloyalty. He then moves among the religious orders, first as a Black monk, a Benedictine, the better to mimic the hypocrite, he says. As a Templar, he wears a black coat of fine fabric so as to show off the cross on his breast. We are a Templar, right? The Cistercian carries a pouch filled with letters confirming his privileges. The Augustinian wears a white habit beneath his wolfish snout, un museau lupin. The pardoner, who is also an abuseur de gens, he abuses people, displays his relics. And this, I'm sorry, if you don't speak French, it's too bad, I'll translate. His saints are Saint Faim, Saint Hunger, and the reliquary contains the spit of the Lord. Saint Meadow Grazer, Saint Peste-Pré, and the relic is the bone of a horse that grazes the meadow. And Saint Itch, the foot of a hen caught by a fox that the wolf had strangled. The satire applies to secular roles as well. The gallant youth is two-faced. He sticks his tongue out on one side and shows a wolfish face on the other. The doctor boasts a beautiful red cloak and a belt of gold. The apothecary's robes are lined with fox fur, which is very elegant for the time. The street performer, with his monkey, now these are rather odd. There's a monkey here and a bear here having problems with a meal, and a dog. He sings from the top of a large stone that is called a trousse putain, which is to hike up the skirts of the prostitutes. Let's see, they should carry, let's see, rosary beads and be hypocritical like men, and in particular the hermit. Archwolf advises his pupils that the one who wants to be most like the man should be a hermit. Gobin frames his book as a grammar manual in 12 chapters, each of which also corresponds to a month of the year, so that the setting changes along with the wolf's persona. It is through the wolf's manipulation of language, however, that Gobin achieves his most acerbic satire. Archwolf interprets Holy Scripture literally or incompletely and removed from context, so that his lessons are ostensibly based on Christian doctrine, but they become anti-moral, and it is left to holy doctrine to rectify them. For example, Archie Lupus, the schoolmaster, calls his pupils in Latin to him. And here you'll see that the reference is to Psalm 33. So he says, Venite filiae audite me. Come, children, hearken to me. But he leaves out the rest of that, which is, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. So Sainte Doctrine comes in and gives you the whole thing. And I'll show you one other page from the original, only because an English reader at some point wrote there's good counsel in this particular book, the 17th century reader of this book. Similarly, for Archwolf, the New Testament example of the rich man who feasted sumptuously each day, this is from the book of Luke, authorizes wolves to fill their bellies. And Christ's transformation of water to wine is the scriptural justification for drinking. Holy doctrine, of course, rectifies the lesson, citing the fate of the rich man who ends up in hell, and the miracle of changing water to wine at the wedding at Cana. It helps to know your Bible well with this book, by the way, is proof of Christ's divinity. In chapter 1, the focus is on grammar element of declension, but it leads Archwolf to decline to do good. The 5 cases are correlated to the 5 senses, which prompt contradictory lessons. Wolves should use their sight to goggle beautiful girls, while the good sheep contemplate the holy sacraments. Taste is for gluttony, not sobriety. Hearing for malicious tales, not sermons. Touch for women and money, not faith. Wolves want to smell sheep, while the very Christian sheep seek the fragrant virtues of humility, patience, and obedience. Every chapter functions in the same manner with scriptural justifications on both sides of the argument. Archwolf is a master of wordplay as well as disguise. He gleefully mixes Latin and French, explaining that his wolves should kill sheep because they are pro nobis for us. They should use credo, which is credit. He dazzles us with rhetorical flourishes and variations in rhythm and rhyme, creating such startling pairs. And again, this is for your French, lubrique and relique, lewd and relics, or ange beau and Bordeaux, beautiful angels and bordellos. To counter the wolf's virtuosity, Sainte Doctrine appeals to our reason, which is hard-pressed to cope with Archwolf's verve. Ravissant, after all, implies not only the rapacious, predatory character of the wolf, but also the ability to deprive us of reason. And when in the last chapter, the wolves themselves recognize that their leader has given them an evil doctrine, they acknowledge having acted contre raison, against reason, and it is therefore reasonable that God render justice. Nevertheless, Gobain leaves us rather entangled in the words, and even holy doctrine gains the upper hand only with the massacre of the wolves. So at the end of chapter 12 long chapters, let's see, we have the wolves being slaughtered by the sheep, the shepherds and their dogs. This is, after all, a priest writing a moral treatise. But the wolves are only part 1 of the book, and their defeat is followed by a dance of death. Death will be dancing with the wolves. Now, the danse macabre, which many of you know, I'm sure, has a long history in medieval Europe, especially in the aftermath of the Great Famine, the Plague, the 100 Years' War, which ended in France in 1453. These events undoubtedly contributed to the idea that death was omnipresent and inescapable, and they helped to explain why the dance of death emerged as a literary and pictorial theme in Europe in the Middle Ages. The first known example combining poetry and images was a mural painted on the walls of the Central Cemetery in Paris, known as the Cemetery of the Innocents. The cemetery lay in the heart of the city, bordering its marketplace. It's a very large and bustling place, as you can see. It was used for celebrations and public picnics, commercial transactions, leisurely walks, and preaching, as well as for burying the dead. If you've been to Paris, you know that this is still the center of the city, but it's now where all the metro lines converge in Les Halles. The burial ground was enclosed by open-roofed arcades So you can see them here. And along the top were bones and skulls in the charnel houses. In 1425, a mural of the Dance of Death was painted in the gallery below the bones. So here, the mural is here. It depicted a cadaver seizing his victims one by one, proceeding in the social hierarchy that characterized medieval Europe, but alternating religious and secular figures. So first we have the Pope and the Emperor, then the Cardinal and the King, and descending to the monk, the peasant, and the newborn child. Running beneath the frescoes was a poem providing a dialogue between the figures of each panel. Now, the cemetery was cleared in the 17th century, and no remnants of the frescoes were preserved. But a successful printer by the name of Guillaume Marchand published a copy of the images in 1485, transforming the murals into a portable version that spread very widely throughout Europe. Each figure was clearly identifiable by his clothing and by an object that he held: the Pope with his cross and tiara, the Emperor with his crown, orb, and sword. And the text below identifies each by name. So you can see, if I can get this, where the Pope is down here. Well, maybe I'll just point: the Pope and the Emperor. Marchand's book was so popular that other printers soon copied it, including my favorite publisher, Verard. See, that's not showing up. Okay. The dance proceeds in hierarchical order: the curate and the laborer. So I have one more. Oops.
Just put the mouse on the paper, Mary Beth. Right. Put the mouse on top of the paper. It should work.
Well, doesn't seem to be.
Sorry.
There. I'll just, okay, so the original figures were, of course, all male, but Marchand decided that another possibility existed, which was to show all the women. So here we have a dance of death for women. The dance proceeds in hierarchical order and by couples. And I have to emphasize this: there's a dead person paired with a living person, and each pair is under an arch with a text below. One stanza for the corpse and one for the supposedly living person or dying person, as you will. Despite the hierarchy, the Dance of Death underscored one essential idea: death is a great equalizer. No one can escape, no matter how powerful or how rich, and death is unpredictable. So the moral lesson is that one should try to lead a good life now, so as to be assured of a good death whenever it arrives. Marchand's images are prefaced by a text in which the author asks viewers to find themselves reflected in one of the secular or ecclesiastical figures and in the grotesquely mirrored corpse partner. So remember that as you're looking at this Dance of Death. Now, Gobin's dance significantly differs from this model. It follows the death of the wolves, and it's presented as punishment for those who have followed the evil doctrine of Archwolf. It is death itself, la mort, who seizes the victims one by one, not one by one, but in groups. It is no longer a dance, but an attack, sometimes by the scythe or spear of death, but often by human actors who are sinners first, and they are guilty of 6 of the 7 deadly sins: gluttony, wrath, pride, lust, envy, and greed, these being the cause of their subsequent crimes. Only sloth is not an issue, apparently by definition. Humans are too lazy even to commit crimes. The victims have names and identities, and they are representatives not of a social class, but rather of a sin that has caused them to kill, betray, cheat, and abuse their power. Death is no longer an equalizer, but a judge and executioner of the wolves. The punishments correspond to those in use for secular criminals in late medieval France, but they are the mere preface to what awaits them as sinners, for not surprisingly, the final scene is of the Last Judgment. To begin, let's see, Death in the form of a cadaver sits in this walled cemetery holding a spear, a scythe, and a shovel to her side. Death brags that she has killed such famous men as Aristotle, Seneca, and Cicero, the 9 worthies, and even the Son of God. She has accomplished all of this with the help of her companion named Accident, who enters the scene boasting of his power over all humanity. A side note, in French, death is feminine, so I always refer to her, and accident is masculine, so he becomes him. Accident describes the various methods at his disposal: drowning, burning, hanging, and illness. His victims die for any reason or none, in bed or in a river. It makes no difference to him or to death how they reach heaven or hell. The victims themselves relate their own stories to explain why and how they died. First to speak, oh dear, it really doesn't like my mouse. Let's see, there. And Adam, of course, oh dear, Zoom quit unexpectedly that's on my screen. It says Zoom quit unexpectedly. Shall I do something?
Okay, then can you get back to the PowerPoint?
I hope so.
That down there. There it goes. I think that's it.
Okay, whoops.
There it goes. There it goes. Okay, there you go.
Are we here? We're
Yeah,
back.
then you should be able to click just on.
Okay, we're back to Adam. No, we're now on, I have to say what Adam blames Eve, of course. This is traditional, right? For giving him an apple. But very interestingly, he accuses himself of gluttony for having eaten it, and then pride for having thought that he could outwit God by disobeying him. Cain follows, and he's represented in the act of killing his brother Abel. The text emphasizes not only his guilt for fratricide, but also his sin of envy, which caused him to kill. Death then addresses the 3 estates. Let's see if I can try this to move. Okay, so we have the 3 estates: the noble, the cleric, and the peasant. Yeah, okay. No one can withstand the assault of Death's 3 handmaidens, which are listed next: war, famine, and mortality, in color, who sit together in this other woodcut. Once again, their victims, ancient and modern, from Cyrus, king of Persia, to Pope Boniface VIII, tell of their guilt and sin. To this point, death is seen as a punishment for enumerated sins. War, famine, and illness result from the sins of the princes in power. But when accident arrives, seated on a bull, and this too is a tradition, he attacks traitors and criminals whom he identifies by name and who in turn relate their own story. The first is Ganelon, the betrayer of Roland in the famous Song of Roland. He delivers a message that no traitor should be spared death. Let's see if I can get it. Okay. From then on, the figures and their crimes are historical, and Gobain enters this realm of secular justice. The first group consists of those who have tried to usurp governments. They're political enemies of the people who are punished for excessive pride. The main example is Marcus Manlius, who is a Roman consul who defended the capital against the invading Gauls, thereby earning the name Capitolanus. When afterwards, however, he tried to seize power, the Roman Senate condemned him to death and threw him into the Tiber River from the Tarpeian Rock. Here he is. Oh, well, maybe he's not here. The woodcut represents a man being thrown from the tower at the rear, and another desperately clinging to a log over the river as accident attacks him. And the lesson is that those who through foolish arrogance usurp the government of the state are guilty of pride and overconfidence in themselves, and they will be punished. Following Manlius, Accident explains that he has used murderers and thieves to kill great lords and bourgeois, but has in turn condemned the thieves. And here's the image of the thief cutting the throat of a poor victim. This woodcut interests me particularly because the position of the victim confused one printer, and he set the woodcut upside down, so that we end up with Death, the cadaver standing on his head. And here's the color version of it. The example of this crime is not a contemporary figure, but a mythological one. It's the fire-breathing giant Cacus, who stole cattle from Hercules and died suffocated when Hercules set fire to his cave. So Cacus warns that thieves and murderers will be drowned or hanged, for they cannot escape accident. The reference to hanging gives rise to two notorious figures, the biblical Haman and the contemporary French advisor to Louis XI, Olivier le Dain. They fall within this group of once powerful officials who had caused the people to suffer. Some of them had been regents and governors of powerful kings and princes, but accident had reduced their power and punished them in various ways, by hanging, banishment, or beheading. And the two he names, let's see, are both hanged, and the woodcut represents this. In Gobin's text, only Haman speaks as the representative of a royal officer who mistreats the people. He had used his authority from the Persian king, and here's my pronunciation problem, Ahasuerus, okay, to condemn the Jews, especially Mordecai, but Esther prevailed upon the king to save them, and Haman was hanged as a traitor on the gallows that he had just built. And if I'm right, we've just celebrated Purim, which is the celebration of this. The second example of royal officers to be condemned is Olivier le Dain, the infamous barber to the French king Louis XI, who amassed a fortune through bribery and theft. He was executed immediately after the king's death for his offenses. Let's see if I can get a color image of that. In the woodcut, one victim is being pulled up the ladder while another is already hanged. And accident specifies that Olivier le Dain was executed at Montfaucon. This is a hill on the outskirts of Paris where the gallows were located. And there's a very famous miniature by Jean Fouquet for the Chronique de France that shows the gallows, and you can see how enormous they are. The text concludes with a reference to inescapable punishment, as accident admonishes his rulers not to allow their officers to mistreat their subjects, warning them that if they so trample the people, he will strike their neck or their head. The penalties vary according to the crime. The thief will be hanged, the heretic burned, the tyrant poisoned or killed by his own people. A woodcut of Death seizing a man holding a purse introduces the next group of criminals, the treasurers. They have swindled the public and acquired wealth. And the text concerns one person in particular, whose name is Betty Sack, who was the treasurer of the Duke of Berry, accused of extortion and excessive taxation by the people of Languedoc, arrested and imprisoned by King Charles VI in 1389. Betty Sack defended himself by declaring he was only acting for the Duke. And indeed, the king's counselors did not believe that he was guilty. However, he had become rich, and he could not repay the sums that he had taken from the people. Facing execution, he followed the advice of treacherous friends and declared himself a heretic, believing that he would then be released to the custody of the bishop rather than left in the king's prison. The bishop, however, sent an inquisitor who determined that Betty Sack was in fact guilty and delivered him to the executioner. So instead of being hanged, he was burned alive. Betty Sack swore too late that he was not a heretic. For Gobain has him say, "I was burned and totally reduced to ashes." Now, this case must have impressed the people because of an implicit rivalry between the Duke and the king, but also because it involves both secular and ecclesiastical justice, as well as different forms of capital punishment. In Gobain's poem, Betty Sack relates his own story, and it corresponds, in fact, to the lengthy account provided by the French chronicler Jean Froissart. This miniature is taken from one manuscript of Froissart's Chronique, where you see him being burned. But there's another manuscript that shows him being hanged and burned, which is quite interesting. And in Verrar's own book own edition of the Chronique, he's shown being burned, but within a room. And so you do wonder how the artist is depicting this, but anyway. Gobain next considers various categories of sinners traditionally mentioned in contemporary literary texts. Knights, if I can get there, who are overconfident of their prowess. And the example is Sir Gawain. Women, next, who like Delilah, deceived men or caused their ruin. So Helen of Troy is a classic example. False lovers who seduce women with music and song. And the example there is Shechem, who raped Jacob's daughter Dinah. Again, we're going back to the Bible. And finally, hypocritical clergy, and I love this. He chose two popes. The 10th century Pope John XII, who surrounded himself with loose women. He died in 964, so Gobain goes back a ways. And Pope Boniface VIII, who died in 1303, who was accused of heresy and sodomy. And in the corresponding woodcuts, of course, we see that they too are subject to death. As the text draws to its close, Accident says that God has given him power to torment his victims as the ordained precursor of death, but he strikes them more or less harshly according to how they have treated others. He singles out those who have acquired wealth illicitly, and he admonishes them to return the goods while they yet have time to do so. A final request from the dead to the living asks the living for prayers that God be merciful to the dead and exempt their souls from pain. In return, the dead will pray that God preserve the living from the fires of hell. Death concludes with a warning to be mindful of God's judgment, which imposes pain specifically on certain categories of sinners: kings and knights, false monks, false religious, false priests, false laymen, all sinners, the proud and the arrogant. Death will lead all of them into the dance, but each will suffer according to his sins. And of course, we end with the final version of the Last Judgment, which the actor witnesses and hears trumpets sounding as the earth splits apart, swallowing the victims of accident and death. After awaking, he recovers his speech and concludes his book, insisting that no one should follow the wolf's doctrine. He identifies himself as the author of the book and constructs these last stanzas on an acrostic where you can read the first letters, give his name, Robertus Gobin. Gobin's text inspired the publisher Verard to order 2 new sets of illustrations, and the dramatic subjects and bold lines of the Dance of Death attracted immediate attention from other printers. To date, I have identified 3 different versions of the set of what's called accidents. All 3 appear in the borders of Books of Hours to accompany the Office of the Dead, beginning with editions dating from 1509. Prior to that date, Books of Hours had employed a sequence of borders imitating the traditional Dance of Death. And here is an example of Verard's borders. And you can see the couple of the cadaver and the victim under an arch, and they're all identified by name. The woodcuts of Gobin's accidents offered a new sequence for the same liturgical office, the Office of the Dead. Guillaume Godard, Gilles Audouin, and Simon Vostre created new blocks of these images, reducing their size and altering them from horizontal to vertical scenes so as to fit in the lateral borders of the pages. So you can recognize now the first and the last scene, but they're presented 2 per page, one above the other, with text above, between, or below, in French or in Latin. Each set begins with the first of Verard's woodcuts, Death Seated in the Cemetery, which is up here. And they continue through 21 images to end with the Last Judgment. So important were these border illustrations for the printers, they included them in the titles of their books. So here's Simon Vostre, and he's calling them the accident de l'homme, and Audouin is calling them figures de la vie de l'homme, figures of the life of man. The execution, let's see, 2 other scenes. The miser being taken by death. You can see that they're in mirror image. So Godard copies the original woodcut from Gobin, but it's reversed by Audouin. And then I'll give you just a few more examples. This is the hanging scene. And again, they're reversed, they're in mirror image. And finally, the execution being thrown from a tower or hanging across a river. The interesting thing, of course, is that these woodcuts, although they derive from Gobin's Loup Ravissant, have lost all connection with them. There's no reference to Gobin, and the title has become something else, Figures of the Life of Man or Accidents of Life. Having assumed the cost of creating an entire set of pieces, each publisher found another use for them besides the borders of the pages of Books of Hours. Audouin combined them into booklets of 2 different formats, 2 or 4 images to the page. So again, we have the same scenes, but now arranged onto a page. Here are 4. This is a quarto-sized book, so it's slightly larger than this one, which is an octavo-sized book. And there are several examples of this. So these are the Audouin's books, which he calls the Dits des États, the sayings of the estates. So again, the title has changed completely from what the original source. Godard created a small booklet in agenda format. Let's see. So you can see this long, narrow format that would fit in your pocket very nicely if you were so inclined. And he calls this the Figures de la Mort, Figures of Death. Only 2 copies of this book are known, at least they're all that I've discovered so far. Both are printed on vellum, and one of them is painted. These booklets were most likely intended as supplements to the books of hours, and their small format contributed to their loss, as well as to their oversight in the rather summary catalogs of the hundreds of editions of books of hours. Several conclusions might be drawn about the text, the illustrations, and the printing of the Loup Ravissant. Robert Gaubin defines his work as a doctrinal moral, a moral doctrine, from which readers can learn to lead virtuous lives while avoiding vice and evil. He cautions them about the last judgment that awaits them in the next world, but exposes the justice that operates in this one, using specific examples from contemporary France that mirror those from past history. The various punishments for certain crimes, hanging, burning, decapitation, and defenestration, may be accidents, but they are controlled first by secular and ultimately by divine justice. As a cleric and ecclesiastical lawyer, Gaubin seems most concerned with the wolves who have harmed the people, whether by usurping power or by impoverishing them through extortion. Each of these wolves will be required to pay retribution before being executed according to custom. In a major revision of the Dance of Death, death is not an equalizer who strikes at random representative types of the social hierarchy, but an administrator of justice who punishes named individuals for committing crimes against the social order. Gaubin's text, long, it's 600 pages, and full of digressions, must nonetheless have impressed the enterprising publisher Antoine Vérard. Here is his printer's mark that appears in the on the last page of the vellum copy. He must have considered it a viable publication, since he not only issued the first edition, but arranged for 2 new sets of woodcuts. The wolves walk, dress, and act like humans, and at the end, the humans who have followed Archwolf are felled by accident and death, to be judged both in this world and the next. Gaubin makes it very clear, one should not dance with the wolves. Thank you. Question.
When you were going through these beautifully decorated, when you were going through these beautifully decorated pages, I noticed that brilliant, 2 different types of blue. Are they lapis and ultramarine?
I don't think they're lapis. I don't really know. Frankly,
Okay,
but
I was just curious because I know ultramarine came in after lapis did in the Roman Empire. And I was wondering, somewhere in the Renaissance period, was there a major shift and could it have been done to these artists?
I think lapis was too expensive at the time to have been used in this. For the beginning of the 16th century. So I think it's.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a comment?
Yes, Terry.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for what a great presentation. I really enjoyed this. I may have missed this. Was it Gaubin that did the wood cuttings as well?
No, although that's a whole other problem. Gaubin gave his manuscript to Vérard, the publisher. The publisher arranged for the woodcuts. And the issue always is who did them, who designed them, who copied them. And I have worked with art historians, and we always end up with the master of something or other, right? Unknown, no name. The woodcuts of the Dance of Death are very striking, as you saw. I mean, and it could well be a German artist who actually cut them, because they're so striking compared to what was also being done in France at the time. But it's one of the great mysteries of the time. Who ordered them, who made the designs, and then who cut the wood, because of course the design probably was placed on a block of wood and then carved around.
And then the assumption would be that each subsequent publisher did their own version of these woodcuts. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, for the books of hours, I think Haldouin copied the original blocks from Gauguin in a smaller size. And then my sense is that it was reversed onto another block and the second printer copied that, which is why they're in mirror image, right? You end up with facing images if you paste a copy onto a block and carve it. Who did them? In what order? I didn't even talk about the third printer because it's even more complicated. He managed to make 26 images instead of 23. And he added a cut of decapitation, which is missing in the Gauguin book. And I think it's an error in Gauguin's book. I think because at that point, one of the woodcuts is reused. And I think that he somehow along the way, they lost or didn't make the cut of the decapitation. So they used a hanging double time. I mean, it's a very cheery subject, I do realize that. But
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Do the original wooden woodcuts exist, or do you mentioned this is actual paper, 500, 600-year-old paper, somewhere in you can go page through it, I guess, but do the original wood
I know of
masters exist?
one master that exists. I mean, we're talking about 500.
No, it seems like wood would preserve better than paper.
The problem is they get lost and they break. I mean, this is one
But
of the big,
paper's even more delicate. I would
Well,
think.
that's why there are only 10 copies of the book left. There were probably 500 made, 500 to 1,000 made. And the vellum copy, of course, was considered precious. It's the one in the Royal Library, the King's copy, as it were. I think blocks of wood, if they get separated from a series, they lose their significance and so on. But I'm actually quite delighted to know that there's one copy, one woodcut left of the Book of Hours border. It's quite something.
If King repeat the 12th copy.
I would expect that he did, although there's no evidence that it actually belonged to. And the other issue about, you may have noticed in my color pictures are a bit awkward because I had to take them myself. And the problem is that the book is about this story and it's very closely bound. And so when you try to open it to take a picture, you really can't do that. But that's the only vellum copy, and I think it went to the Royal Library at some point.
What I'd like to know is how did Gauguin die? Because then I'd be interested in, okay, how did Axel deal with him?
I don't know. I imagine that he's a good cleric and he got less rights and was.
I was gonna say, oh, apply this entire mythology to him as well.
It's quite interesting that he really went to task on the clergy. He just had no patience for them. He was.
Gauguin had quite an imagination, I would say.
Well, I sort of laugh about this, saying that it's actually a very modern text, despite all of the things that are criticized are really quite universal. Quite universal.
Absolutely.
So
is the distinction between death and accident unique to him, or is it something that turns up elsewhere? I haven't encountered it before.
there's one prior text called, love this, the mort de la pomme, which again is a play on words. Mort can be a bite, the bite of the apple, and it can be the death, right?
Yeah.
So this poem predates Gauguin's, and it brings up accident, riding on a bull. So there is, Gauguin's not totally new in that respect. But yeah.
Another question. again, back to printing, is there any difficulty or evidence about the difference between printing on paper and vellum? Paper was very porous and vellum was very tight.
Well, it's also very expensive. So we have more copies on paper, obviously, than on vellum. I haven't seen anything that indicates technically a difference. I mean, they
Yeah.
put on a frame.
They knew
and
how
the
to do
frame
it.
They knew how to do it. They knew how to do it. And there are the printer that I've worked on forever, specialized in vellum copies. So he somehow got the job done.
I'm interested in the content of spiritual content of the book. It's really very funny to read because if you study Latin, this is a church Latin all the way, and it's full of really nasty little things going all over the thing. And I'm just saying we should rewrite this book because today's is exactly the same.
Truly modern.
And even the banks now, watch out, what's of today.
It does strike me every time I look at this again. I mean, he really was against the clerics who were dishonest, and
Yeah.
they seem to be everywhere. And he especially hated people who were getting rich off the backs of somebody else. So these are the ones who are really taken to task.
So we should write a satire.
Nothing, but the interesting thing is that he doesn't really spend a lot of time with women, they were also constantly attacked, right? I mean, it's all anti-feminine tradition, but he wasn't particularly anti-feminine. His real attacks were against the church.
Was there a reaction from the church?
Yeah. Retribution.
I don't know. I mean, he was a lawyer he's a church lawyer as well as a priest. So I think what comes up in this text is that he had to try cases where people were blatantly corrupt and the corruption just he couldn't tolerate. Mind you, it's a very difficult text in the sense that he goes on for pages and pages. And what people remember is how funny the wolf is. I mean, the wolf makes you laugh. He comes out with these outrageous things saying, oh, well, we're going to go gobble up the sheep because God says we're supposed to feed our bellies, so and we're bad, but God made us bad, so therefore we can continue to be bad, right? There's no, and then and he's writing in verse and everything rhymes and you have these wonderful pairs of words, and then you get holy doctrine who comes forth and she quotes the Bible and she quotes Augustine and Boethius and everybody that you can think of. Oh, and the other thing is he loves the decretals. I don't know whether you know the Christian laws were established into books very long in the 12th century, and he references those. She references those forever, and you look at this and you think, I really have to read this. It's long and painful, and she goes on and on, which is why it's 600.
I have a quick question. I know I learned recently that things like spelling and word usages that was only standardized after Oxford and Webster came along in the 1800s. These must be filled with misspellings or difficult to translate.
Not misspellings, spellings of the time. And one of the things.
But even those would be inconsistent thing, because I've seen, where the word mosquito is spelled 20 different ways.
It's funny, I've just written my glossary and I put in all the possible spellings of the same word because it's never the same. And there was no standardization, and the things that there's certain common developments that we're used to, like forest was still written with an S and now it's forêt, the S being replaced by an accent circumflex. But yeah, there's no standardization and the grammar is all sort of twisted around and they love long sentences. So you start here and you end up somewhere else. And there's no punctuation. I didn't mention that, but there's no punctuation, there's no capitalization. So everything that you're trying to read, you have to be alert to. Yeah.
Just that's the just.
No, I think Gobin wrote the whole thing. I actually question whether he intended to put the two pieces together, whether he intended to put the wolves with the Dance of Death, and I'm not convinced that he did, if only because Verard, the publisher, was notorious for combining things. He published books under very fancy titles. One of them is called The Garden of Pleasure. And in it, and he gives two authors' names on the title, but remember, there's no copyright, right? This is free copyright. So there are two authors named. The only author who really wrote anything in the book is the first text, which lasts maybe 20 pages. And after that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's, so, you know, I think Gobin wrote it because at the end there is this paragraph where he signs with his acrostic, you know, this is his name. Whether he intended them to be together, I'm not convinced.
Are there any references in the text to the images?
Oh, constant, yes,
Okay, so-
which is very interesting, which does indicate that Gobin was in some sort of relationship with the publisher, right? He did know that there was going to be a picture there. It's a little confusing only because the French word for picture at the time was histoire, history. So the history could be a verbal account or it could be a picture, but when it occurs, it seems to be followed by a picture. Yeah, I think so.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Next one is Lawrence Widner. Title on it, but he's known for writing things for UEP.
Yeah.
Publications, and he's from the history. So that's in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, you said death is male and accident is female. Well, it's the other way around. Death is being happened and accident. Okay. Different. No, in terms of they made the comment about.
Let's take her.
Well, okay, I would think that would be the more common.
I'm sorry if you're.
Yeah, so okay.
Fine.
We started to